Hey everybody, it's a Lit Teacher here, and today we're going to talk about the fantastic poem Follower by none other than Seamus Heaney, one of the heavyweights of poetry. Let's get into it. As with all of my poetry analysis videos, I'm going to start with a brief bio of Seamus Heaney, a little bit of background context for you before we get into reading the poem itself, and then just try to understand it at the most basic level. I'm then going to discuss two key themes which I think are super interesting and poignant when it comes to this poem before I dive into a deep line-by-line analysis where we really break it down, looking at the language and poetic devices that are being used. I'll end the video with my lit take, my own personal take on the poem, which you can take and use if it's helpful to you. It might be useful for those IGCSE exams if this poem comes up. So let's get into talking about Seamus Heaney. Seamus Heaney is an absolutely huge figure in the history of literature. He is probably one of the most influential poets of all time, dare I say. So where did things begin for him? Well, he was born in Northern Ireland, and he came from an agricultural family, a very large Irish Catholic family. He was the eldest of 9 children. Now, Follower is from his first collection of poetry, which was called Death of a Naturalist. It was written in the mid to late 60s, 1966, I believe it was released, and it establishes quite a few key themes in Heaney's work, notably his reflections on his own childhood, his memory, also some discussion around agriculture and its place within a broader Irish identity. Now, Heaney would become, as I've already mentioned, a colossal figure in the world of poetry, so much so that he actually won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995, and he went on to lecture and teach poetry at both Harvard and Oxford universities. So this is a really big dog in the world of poetry. His poetry features really masterful crafting. He is absolutely precise with his use of language. There are very many layers to what he is doing. He's very good at using imagery and blending that with narrative, sometimes drawing on the Irish ballad tradition. He's also good at shifting perspectives and bringing in that kind of lyrical quality that we often expect from the Irish poets, as I've already kind of touched on. It's also amazing how he uses symbolism. His poems are often very plain, very direct, but the symbolism is incredibly meaningful, and the kind of end point of many of his poems is just a knockout punch. It just makes you feel something really heavy and emotional, and Follower is no different. I will now read Follower for you. I will do my best to do this excellent poem justice. Follower by Seamus Heaney. My father worked with a horse plough. His shoulders globed like a full sail strung between the shafts and the furrow. The horses strained at his clicking tongue. An expert, he would set the wing and fit the bright steel-pointed sock. The sod rolled over without breaking. At the head rig, with a single pluck of reins, the sweating team turned round and back into the land. His eye narrowed and angled at the ground, mapping the furrow exactly. I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, fell sometimes on the polished sod. Sometimes he rode me on his back, dipping and rising to his plod. I wanted to grow up and plough, to close one eye, stiffen my arm. All I ever did was follow in his broad shadow round the farm. I was a nuisance, tripping, falling, yapping always. But today it is my father who keeps stumbling behind me and will not go away. Let's do some vocabulary here. Let's start with just the ploughing jargon, okay? When I studied English literature and I trained to be a teacher, never in my wildest dreams did I think that I would be doing heavy research into the specific parts of a vintage plough, and yet here I am. So I'm going to try and break down the ploughing terms for you. These are the terms that I've highlighted in yellow, and I'm going to try and use some images and diagrams to give you a bit of an understanding of the parts of a plough because they're very important to actually understanding the poem itself. Okay, so here I have a beautiful painting of a vintage plow, right? And a guy driving behind it with the two horses leading. Now, the two horses are called the team. So when Heaney refers to the team, he's talking about the two horses that pull the plow. Now, going clockwise here, the wake is what is left behind when the ground is plowed. So that is, I guess, the freshly plowed soil behind the gentleman pushing the plow or driving the plow. That is called the wake. In the same way that when a boat is riding on the ocean, it will leave waves behind it, which we also refer to as the wake. Now, the shafts are the two parts of the plow that the person driving it holds onto to direct the plow and make it go in the direction that they want it to. And the reins we might be more familiar with. These are essentially the things that are attached to the horse and are also used by people to direct the horses by pulling on the reins and directing their noses where you want them to go. Now, the sod is the ground, or rather, it is the unbroken ground. The ground that is yet to be plowed would be called the sod, the grassy stuff here, I guess. And the furrow is the line that would be created. So once you have plowed the land into a really nice, clean line, that line would be called the furrow. Okay, another beautiful diagram of a vintage plow for you. So we get a close-up of the shafts, so you can see those in a little bit more detail. And going clockwise again, at the tip of the metal part of the plow, the part that actually plows the soil, you have the sock. And then going along the bottom cutting edge there, we have what is called the wing. And it's really interesting just to point out that the plow itself, or rather the sort of cutting part of the plow, the wing area, looks kind of like a sail, and that will be a little bit relevant when we start to look more specifically at some of the language in the poem. So there's a bit of a breakdown on the parts of a plow for you. The last key term that I need to make mention of is the head rig. The head rig is mentioned in the poem. The head rig is essentially the unplowed part of a field. And the reason it is unplowed is because it's actually where the plow would turn around to go back into the other direction. So you need to leave, I guess, a strip of land to allow for this maneuvering, and that strip of land is called the head rig. Okay, so just some other terms in the poem that you may or may not be familiar with, some other vocabulary I just feel it's necessary to unpack a little bit further. So we have the term globed, his shoulders globed. It's essentially, it just means to be rounded like a globe. A globe, as we know, is a round shape. So if something is globed, it is rounded, I suppose. In the bottom, the last line in the second stanza, we have the term pluck. Now, you might be familiar with this term. It's not a very unusual word, but I guess a pluck, we might know, is a quick tug and release of something. And it also draws our mind towards music and the playing of stringed instruments, which you would also pluck. And that will also become relevant when we start to analyze the poem shortly, too. So, pluck. A couple more for you in the middle two stanza 3 and 4. So, hobnailed, what the heck does that mean? Well, hobnailed boots are a very specific kind of boot that are essentially held together with hobnails, kind of metal nails. And you can see an image of some hobnailed boots there, bearing in mind that Heaney's poem is set many years ago now. probably don't have the most high-tech footwear. And hobnail boots, very tough boots, would be needed to be working in the soil all day to gain some grip on the ground and not slip over in the same way that, rugby boots stop you from slipping in muddy ground as well. So hobnailed relates to hobnailed boots. And lastly, I've got the word plod. Plod is just a kind of way of walking, I guess. We sometimes refer to somebody as plodding along. So to plod would be to walk with heavy footsteps, I guess you might say. And in the last two stanzas, stanza 5 and stanza 6, the word broad just means large or wide. Nuisance. To be a nuisance is to be annoying, to be a hassle, to be causing problems. And the word yapping refers to talking constantly, kind of like I am now, just yapping away. You're probably wanting me to get on with this video, so we will move on now. Understanding. Let's just whip through the poem. A very basic understanding of what actually happens here. This is a narrative poem. It is telling a story or an account of something, in this case, the memories of the speaker watching his father as he would plow fields. So let's just get into a little bit more detail about what's actually happening in the poem. I'm going to go 2 by 2 by 2. So we'll do stanza 1 and 2, stanza 3 and 4, and then stanza 5 and 6. Okay, so stanza 1 and 2. So we have a speaker who is describing his childhood memories of watching his father drive the plow to prepare the land, right? And he describes his father as being an expert, and that his father would click his tongue to give directions to the horses, to signal to the horses what he wanted them to do. And he was exceptionally good at creating furrows in the land with the plow. They're near perfect, and he could do them almost in a single push without stopping. So that is what is happening in stanza 1 and stanza 2. In stanza 3 and 4, we get some more detail around this. The poem likes to sort of zoom in on the action, particularly what the father is doing as he plows. So here we get some admiration of the father as he plows, his focus, his attention to detail while he works. And since the speaker is just a little boy, he recounts the way that he struggled to follow his father through the heavy soil, and his father would occasionally pick him up and put him on his back as he worked, possibly just to get him out of the way so that he wasn't being such a nuisance, as he kind of mentions later on in the poem. Now, the last two stanza are really interesting. So, what happens here is we get this idea from the speaker that he really wanted to be like his father. He wanted to drive the plow with the same determination and skill that he saw in his old man. And he regrets in a way that he was just a nuisance, a little boy who was just getting in the way, talking too much, as he tried to follow in the footsteps of his father, quite literally. However, what happens in the final stanza is we get a shift in time. The poem jumps ahead many years. The speaker is now an adult, and he states that now that he's grown up, the roles have reversed, and it is actually his elderly father who now follows behind him and will not go away. So the whole poem builds up to the idea of the little boy following his father growing up, and the elderly father now following the adult boy. Two key themes for you. The first one is this idea of the father-son relationship dynamic. It's incredibly powerfully presented in this poem. A few points on this. So, as children, we follow our parents, right? We literally follow them. They lead the way for us. They set the example. When we go to the supermarket, we kind of trail behind them, we follow them wherever they go. So there's this quite literal idea of following your parents, of them being the leaders in your life, if you will. And for boys, especially if we're thinking about Heaney, he's writing about a time many years ago that are arguably more traditional than the times that we might have now, there's this element of a boy hero worshipping his dad, right? His dad embodying these stereotypes of being the strong male role model in his life, the provider for the family, and the protector of the family. So that's what we kind of get here. And for this reason, there can be this kind of feeling of inadequacy for boys because they want to try to live up to the example of their father. They also want to please their father by being like them in a way. And the expectation that we will fill their shoes and follow in their footsteps can be a real burden, especially on boys as they're trying to grow up. Inevitably, what we get is time changing everything. So, as time progresses and we grow up and our parents get older, we start to assume the role of the leader, I guess you might say. They start to follow us, potentially because they now need us. They cannot maybe look after themselves. They cannot work. Their bodies are getting older. Their minds might even be failing. So our parents become dependent on us in the same way we were dependent on them as children. And the poem really poignantly, quite emotionally points out this in the very end with the closing lines. Another theme that I really want to draw on and make reference to, and I think it's particularly relevant to my context here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is the idea of the agricultural tradition, right? Farming and the history of farming and its importance in society, I guess you might say. Now, Heaney depicts working the land as being a really honorable and noble tradition. He shows farming to be dignified, to require great skill, great technical ability, strength, attention to detail. There's even this level of artistry and beauty in what the father is doing as he is plowing the land. And remember, I mentioned that word pluck and how it relates to musical instruments and how artistically a musician might pluck the strings on, say, a guitar or a violin. Well, here we get that word pluck because Heaney's almost saying that the way that he was able to control his horses, his team, and the way that he was able to drive the plow in one single fluid motion showed a kind of level of artistry that we might see in something as beautiful as a musician's playing. The speaker aspires to be like his father, yet he's unable to show the same level of mastery. He depicts himself as being kind of clumsy, tripping and falling, almost a failure at the skills required to do what his dad does. Heaney really portrays this agricultural tradition as being something that's at the heart of the Irish identity. That's something to celebrate, something to preserve, something to protect. And I know this is certainly how many farmers feel in my context in New Zealand as well. And I'm going to touch on this a little bit later when I give you my lit take on the poem. So let's get into some analysis now. There is a lot I could say about this poem. I could really get into the weeds with the rhythm, the way that sibilance is used, the alternating iambic, tetrameter, and trimeter, and all of that stuff. Of course, I want to keep this video focused for you, so I'm not going to get really specific into some of that detail, though I would encourage you to read about it because it just shows you how astonishingly well crafted Heaney's writing is. So let's get into stanza 1 and stanza 2 of the poem. Let's talk about the form and meter of the poem first. Now, the poem is formally in 6 quatrains, that is 6 sets of 4-line stanza, and it's very regular in that sense. If you look at the poem on the page, it's very regular looking. The lines are of similar length, and I don't think it's a stretch to make a comparison between the formal kind of perfection of the poem on the page to the perfection of the furrows in the soil that the father plows. I think this is a deliberate parallel that Heaney is trying to exercise in the form of the poem, and it's not a stretch to make this comparison. The poem is ballad-like. So, ballad is a kind of poem that has a narrative that tells a story, and it also has a lyrical, rhythmic quality that's often caused by the use of iambic tetrameter or iambic trimeter. However, Heaney does deviate from the ballad form. He uses an ABAB rhyme scheme. And this irregular meter and irregular rhyme scheme that kind of slips in places kind of echoes the irregular movements of somebody as they plowed and plodded through heavy soil. There are moments where the poem is very regular and the meter is moving in a lovely lyrical fashion, only for it to kind of turn around and then go back. And this is really clever writing from Heaney to actually adopt a form that is similar to the movements of ploughing itself. Now, the narrative is told in past tense. The speaker is now an adult and they are reflecting on their childhood memories. And as I've already mentioned, there's this abrupt shift in the end of the poem where it jumps to today in the closing lines. Now, I will touch on who the speaker is in a little bit more detail later on. Suffice to say, you can certainly read into it being Heaney, but of course, as with any poem, you can read it however you want to. If you can make a convincing argument for a specific reading, then that's the beauty of poetry, right? Let's look at the title now and stanza one. So, follower, let's just talk about that title for a moment. So, there's this thing called denotation and connotation. If you don't know what that means, well, denotation is the exact meaning of a word, the literal meaning, and connotation is the kind of symbolic meanings of a word, the things that that word can mean, other associations that we might have with it. So, quite literally, the denotation of follower is like following somebody, as we see in the poem, right? Throughout stanza 4 and 5, the boy is literally following his father. And then in stanza 6, when we get that time shift, it's now the father who is literally following the son. But there are multiple connotations to the term follower. We think about things like to follow an example, the way that the boy might be trying to follow his father's example. Ideas around legacy and leadership, and about how children kind of grow up to maybe take over the family farm and follow in their parents' footsteps in that respect. And we might also think about the kind of negative connotation of a follower, somebody who's maybe not capable, kind of level of inadequacy in following, right? You can't lead, so you follow. We get a little bit of this through the speaker's account of following his father and his inability to do what his dad does. So there's a lot of interesting potential meanings in the title of the poem, Follower. Let's get into talking a little bit about stanza one. And I want to jump into the second line and look at the specific diction, the use of the word globed. Now, I've already explained that globed means to be rounded, right? And it kind of creates this image of the father's strength, right? His round, broad shoulders, his kind of powerful, probably muscular physique. But there's also a symbolic allusion here to this guy called Atlas. And you might have heard of Atlas. Atlas is the guy in Greek mythology who's literally carrying the world on his shoulders for eternity. He's like the strongest god that there is, holding up the entire planet. And that's kind of like what a father might be in a family, right? You could argue, particularly back in the day, that they kind of carry the burden of this protector and provider role, and that they need to be that source of strength that carries the family on their shoulders. So it's a really interesting allusion that Heaney is making with the simple diction around the word globed. There's also this lovely simile that follows it, that his shoulders globed like a full sail strung. And the simile gives us some further imagery, and it begins a really interesting extended metaphor around like maritime nautical sailing imagery, right? Here we have the image of a sail, but there's going to be a lot of other references to things to do with sailing and water and, you know, directing a ship through the sea. We're going to get some more references like this, so just keep that in mind. The last thing that I wanted to just touch on here is all these S sounds, and I've actually highlighted them for you. This is sibilance, right? We've got these S sounds. There's actually a lot of sibilance in the poem. Again, I'm not going to get into the weeds about all the specific instances of sibilance, but there's a lot of soft sibilance, especially in the opening stanza. Now, this S sound creates this kind of hushed and calm rhythm. And to me, that kind of evokes the father's quiet control of his team of horses. You could almost imagine him not speaking loudly, just whispering if he needs to direct his horses in a certain way. And this is kind of broken only by the onomatopoeia in the word clicking, the way that the father would click his tongue again to signal to the horses something he wanted them to do. So it's very clever, and it adds to the imagery of the poem by giving it this kind of auditory quality as well. Let's jump into stanza 2 now. And stanza 2 is really interesting because it opens with this fragmented sentence. In fact, it's the only fragmented sentence in the entire poem. It's an expert. It opens an expert. And this fragment, which is followed by the full stop, the caesura, which kind of cuts the idea and the line in half, is a really definitive statement on the skill of the father, that he's an expert. The speaker really wants to state this very sharply and very plainly for us as the reader. He was an expert. And this is followed by a lot of technical description of his expertise. This is where we get all that agricultural jargon and slang that I ran through when I discussed the vocabulary, right? And this again shows this admiration for his craft, but it also relates to the speaker's awareness of the craft of plowing and agriculture itself. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in my lit take very shortly. The end stopped lines are really interesting. Now, a lot of the poem ends with end stopped lines, and this gives this resemblance to the furrows that I've already kind of touched on, right? If you think about a guy plowing a furrow and then they get to the end and then they stop, that is kind of like an end stopped line in poetry. It goes in one direction and then it stops, and then you get another furrow, and so on and so forth. But there is occasionally some enjambment where ideas will spill over into the following lines, and there's this deviation from the end stop lines, and that also mirrors the kind of stopping and starting of a person plowing the fields, as I've already mentioned several times now. And last but not least, I've singled out that word pluck. I've already talked about this, but the connotation of pluck draws on this symbolic connection to a masterful musician playing an instrument, the same way that the father is masterful in the way that he plays and drives the plow. Stanza 3. Okay, so stanza 3 is really interesting because we have this enjambment. It actually carries over from the previous stanza. If you were to look back at the end of stanza 2, you will see that it flows on into the beginning of stanza 3. And this enjambment and caesura again reinforces the stopping, the turning, and the starting of the father as he maneuvers the plow through the sod. You kind of imagine him turning on the head rig, the end of the land that hasn't been plowed, to maneuver his plow in the opposite direction. Now, we have some really intriguing diction here. So we have all of these words that are very precise words: narrowed, angled, mapping, exactly. They all relate to precise execution. And they all fit into what we call a semantic field. So, a kind of group of words that all relate to something specific. In this case, cartography or map making. All of the terms, something narrows, something is angled, something is mapping, something is exact. They all kind of relate, at least in my mind, to map making and the way that maps are. And this kind of connects to the water and sailing again, and the way in which, a master sailor will rely on maps to navigate water. So it's again this extended maritime metaphor coming through. The tone of the poem is really one of admiration at this point, okay? The speaker clearly admires his father. He's describing his physical strength, his technical ability, his intellect, and kind of knowing what he needs to do, and his steely determination, his ability to manage his horses, to drive a furrow in one single pluck. It's really admirable the way that the speaker is describing what the father is doing on the land. Now, stanza 3 signifies a bit of a shift because we get this personal pronoun I. So here the poem shifts from describing the father to now talking about the boy, the speaker reflecting on himself, I. And he says, I stumbled in his hobnailed wake, okay? And this really shows a juxtaposition of the child and his inability contrasted against what the father can do or his ability, how good he is. It's juxtaposed with how inept and kind of useless the son describes himself as being. We also get the speaker literally following his father, okay, and falling in the footsteps of his father. Now, there's some pretty symbolic connotations here. There's a pretty common phrases that we often use. We might use idioms like to follow in someone's footsteps or to walk in someone's shoes. And that is almost literally what is being described here. A boy trying to step in the footsteps of his father only to kind of clumsily trip and fall because, yeah, he can't fill those shoes yet. The verbs are really interesting as well. We get in the last line the verbs dipping and rising, as the boy sits on his father's back and his father's body moves up and down as he plows the land. And this again evokes the dipping and rising of waves on water, as does the word wake, which I've already referred to. And this connects to the kind of plod which describes the father's rhythmic walk. Not only this, but the iambic rhythm of the poem here dips and rises between a kind of perfect and imperfect meter. So we have all these kinds of things that are adding up to the kind of rhythm of the father as his body moves and he dips and rises, walking through the soil. And this kind of evokes a ship kind of bouncing on the water. So again, we have that maritime imagery and metaphor coming through. The final two stanza of this poem are just stunning. And again, we get the first person pronoun I to kick off both stanza 5 and stanza 6. Indeed, this becomes anaphora, a kind of repeated phrasing that we get to kick off each of these stanzas, as I've already mentioned. It opens stanza 3, 4, and 5 with I. And this emphasizes the speaker and, as I've already signaled, the shift to him reflecting on himself. Now, Heaney repeats some descriptive details to show how greatly the speaker aspires to be like his father, to do as he did. We've already had descriptions around the way that the father would look at the land and the way that he would move his body. So there's some repetition of this content here. There's also the explicit clue in the third line of stanza 5 that the speaker is the follower. All I ever did was follow, he states. And the use of this reflective past tense creates this tone of almost regret and even sort of sadness and melancholy. The speaker could not be like his father. He wants to be, but he just can't. He's not the same person. We also have this description which is almost exaggerated, it's almost hyperbole. The way that he had to follow in his broad shadow, we imagine a boy, completely shrouded by this broad shadow of his father. And this again reaffirms the kind of inadequacy of the son to live up to his own aspirations to be like his father. And again, this sort of symbolic phrase, this idiom that we might refer to sometimes, the idea of living in somebody else's shadow, that's kind of what it reminds me of. In the last stanza, Heaney again uses some pretty important verbs, and these reinforce the kind of awkward movements of the boy, the way that he's tripping and falling, and he's a nuisance because he's always yapping. He's kind of hindering his father's work, and he's also failing to emulate him at the same time. Now, there's a significant shift with but today and the caesura, the full stop that precedes it. It's a very abrupt cut and it signals this kind of shift now to the present. We're now in today. We're no longer looking back, talking about the past. We're very much talking about what is happening now. And we get this idea that many years have actually passed, and the speaker is now an adult, and he is being followed by his elderly father. Now, this section of the poem, from But Today onwards, is actually one complete self contained sentence, and that further separates it from the rest of the poem. It's almost a separate part of the poem, as of course it would be, considering the time shift component that I've already discussed. The use of the verb stumbling is quite significant because it draws parallels to tripping and falling, which is the way that the speaker described himself, except now he's describing his father stumbling. And this relates the clumsy boy to the now clumsy father. And it's also really relevant to point out that in stanza 4, Heaney's already used the phrase stumbled, or the word stumbled rather. And this connects these two parts of the poem, the stumbling boy in stanza 4, the boy who stumbled rather, and the stumbling father that we get at the end. So this again links the two together and shows this kind of role reversal. It's no longer the boy stumbling, it's actually the father this time. My lit take. Okay, what do I think about this poem? Well, I think this poem is frickin' amazing. It is expertly crafted. Wow, their level of detail and what Heaney is doing and how aware he is of how he's crafted this thing is just kind of mind blowing in places. The way that the form and the rhythm connect to the subject matter, it's actually incredible. The way that the poem kind of stops and starts like somebody plowing the land, it's masterful. Now, I really do think that the poem must be autobiographical, okay? So, like, what do we know about Heaney? Well, we know that Heaney was the eldest in an agricultural family and, like, probably should have taken over the family business, right? Except he doesn't. He goes and he becomes a poet, something that you can only imagine his father might have looked down on, a kind of profession that's maybe not even considered to be a real job by some people. So it's kind of interesting that Heaney chose not to follow in his father's footsteps and become a farmer. And there's a lot of feelings wrapped up in the kind of regret of this. And it's also really interesting to think of Heaney plowing his own path forward, through the furrows that he creates, the lines of the page in his poetry. Now, despite the speaker's perceived inadequacy, the fact that he feels he can't live up to his father's expertise and level of skill at driving the plow, it's pretty clear through the language and the description that This guy knows a lot about plowing and he really understands what it takes to plow a field successfully. So there is this kind of like interesting celebration of agriculture. And you could say that Heaney actually does know what he's talking about. You've got to give him some credit in this respect. And it's also something to consider the celebration of agriculture in a day and age where a lot of these skills have been lost. We use a lot of heavy machinery to plow the land now, but there was a time not that long ago when people had to do this themselves using horses and their own physical strength. And it's something to just touch on in a day and age where farmers maybe get beat up a little bit in the media, particularly something that we might see in my country of New Zealand. There's often a lot of controversy around this. And yeah, we know there are rogue farmers out there that probably aren't doing things brilliantly, but there's a lot of really brilliant farmers, very skilled farmers who work the land and care for the land in the same way that Heaney's father seemed to. And the poem really made me think about that and reflect on it a little bit. By far, the most thought-provoking thing for me is just the way the poem conveys this shift from childhood to adulthood and this tragic role reversal that happens. The way that we experience our parents aging, it's honestly heartbreakingly conveyed in the poem. As a person who's lost their father, my father passed away a couple of years ago now, and having seen him kind of lose the physical strength that I associated with him as a child, it really struck a chord with me. The way that we grow up and we kind of assume the provider and protector role for our parents when that's what they've done for us their whole lives. So the poem is really moving in the way that it deals with that thematically. There's also this really interesting ambiguity in the final line. The fact that he describes his father as following him and that he will not go away. Does the speaker kind of fail to measure up not only to his father's prowess and skill working the land, but his tolerance and patience now that the roles are reversed? In the poem, when the boy is annoying the father lifts the boy onto his shoulders and carries him and continues working. And now we have a speaker who's describing a father following him and the fact that he will not go away. It's kind of ambiguous whether or not he's upset or annoyed by his father, which just adds an interesting dimension to that closing line. I also want to mention the way that we can kind of expand out to read the poem more symbolically. The way that the poem might actually be about a generational break, a way in which the rural agricultural tradition was kind of replaced by modernity or modern society. The way that the son follows his own path and kind of goes out and does his own thing and doesn't do the same thing that his dad did. It's kind of similar to the way in the 1960s, when the poem was published, by the way, there was this thing called the counterculture, which was when young people really rejected the values of the past and really tried to reject what their parents stood for. The poem kind of explores that in a sort of more broad, kind of meta way. So that's just another interesting dimension that you might want to think about, and it's something that I certainly think about when I read the poem too. And that was Follower by Seamus Heaney. If you like what I'm doing on my channel, The Lit Teacher, you can subscribe by clicking over here. There'll also be some other videos you could check out up here. I'm going to work through the IGCSE poetry syllabus. There'll be more videos like this coming out in the future. But until next time, when I see you again, ka kite, and best of luck with your exams and your study of English literature.